Recording has started. We're going to start in just a moment. I have a few housekeeping things to go over, but once again, welcome to our part 2 of Lead the Charge TMACOG Tech. We had a wonderful session yesterday. I know many of you that are participating today participated yesterday, so thank you so very much for coming back. If you did not or were you not able to participate, we have recorded that session, and that session will be available in the upcoming weeks. We'll be able to put it on our website and share that with this group as well. Everyone will be muted and cameras will be off except for the presenters. Once I start sharing my screen, we'll get going with that. Please keep your questions until the end, but you are able to type them into the chat function, and I will reference them once all of the presentations are complete. So start thinking of your questions. If you want to jot them down or type them up into the chat right now, that's great, but we'll reference them at the end of the session. We want to be conscious of everybody's time. Like I said yesterday, we're very appreciative of everybody taking time out of their day. Yesterday, we were pretty good. We were under 60 minutes. So we're hoping to do that again today. So we're going to try to streamline it, keep those questions to the end. I will reference those, like I said. Today's session is piggybacking off of yesterday's session. So yesterday we had a really great overview of electric vehicle charging stations, the infrastructure, and then really what communities and jurisdictions should be thinking about when it comes to zoning, code, accessibility, permitting, things of that nature. So again, if you weren't able to join us yesterday, it was a great session. Look forward to that video. It's about 53 minutes long. So if you have another lunch hour in the next couple weeks, feel free to sit down and enjoy that. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Josh Strickland from the Toledo-Lucas County Port Authority, and he's going to introduce himself and we'll get started. Let me get this PowerPoint shared.
Good afternoon, everyone. Josh Strickland from the Toledo-Lucas County Port Authority. I manage on behalf of the port our Better Buildings Northwest Ohio PACE financing program. First, on behalf of the Toledo Port, thank you, Rosanna, and all of the TMACOG team for having me this morning, and really excited to share on a number of different initiatives that might be able to assist with electric vehicle charging stations and other energy efficiency financing matters that I think the broader group can really benefit from. On the next slide, a brief overview of the Toledo-Lucas County Port Authority. We were established in 1955 to administer the St. Lawrence Seaway, where the Maumee River meets Lake Erie. In the 80s, we began managing Toledo Express and Toledo Executive Airport. We have about 180 individual commercial lease properties across all of downtown Toledo, more broadly Toledo and Lucas County for special use purposes. On the next slide, you will find a list of different financing programs that through the Port's Development Division, we administer large and small lending, anywhere from $10,000 financing through our Diversified Contractors Accelerator program to provide capital for contractors who don't have the funding to make payroll, up through the Northwest Ohio Bond Fund to provide direct investment toward real estate and equipment purchases at the ports, through the port's Northwest Ohio Bond Fund, which is currently the highest credit rated, investment grade credit rated bond fund in the state of Ohio at A-, where we are able to deliver fixed interest rate financing to broad projects. On the next slide, we'll begin to focus on PACE financing. PACE is an acronym, stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy, and describes the repayment mechanism for what is otherwise a construction loan program. Any building improvement which has a qualified, which will result in a direct energy savings for a facility, including EV charging stations, LED lighting, a new roof, insulation, can be PACE eligible. The Toledo Port leverages its Northwest Ohio Bond Fund, issues energy bonds, takes those bond proceeds, and further lends those proceeds to individual projects. To date, we have entered into 180 individual property assessed clean energy financings to improve the energy efficiency of buildings all across Northwest Ohio. On the next slide, you'll see eligible improvements that are able to be financed with PACE financing. I always encourage everyone to think very broadly. Any building improvement that will result in an energy savings of the facility could qualify for PACE financing. There isn't necessarily a energy savings requirement, just that there is a savings present. So the program has up to a 30% loan to value maximum allowable PACE loan, which affords property owners a great opportunity to finance at a below market fixed interest rate through the Toledo Port's PACE financing program, a number of different building improvements, including EV charging infrastructure. On the next slide, we will touch on different eligible uses of PACE financing. Any commercial property, whether governmental, not-for-profit, or for-profit businesses, can take advantage of the Toledo Port's PACE financing program. The way that we deliver PACE financing to Northwest Ohio is through energy special improvement districts. The Port, in partnership with 28 local municipalities, has established a network of 17 energy special improvement districts who have recognized the benefit of offering below market fixed interest rate financing to their constituents and have chosen to participate in the Better Buildings Northwest Ohio financing program. To date, we have delivered over $81 million of competitive below market fixed interest rate financing for Northwest Ohio property owners to advance and save on energy costs and improve their facilities through Better Buildings Northwest Ohio. With that, I think I will turn it over to Simon with the City of Toledo.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Simon Nee. I am the Grants Commissioner for the City of Toledo, and I'm here today to talk about some of the current and upcoming federal funding opportunities that are out there for EV charging infrastructure. These are grants where Josh was focusing more on the financing side. These are grant awards. So I think most of us know that the federal government is investing in EV charging infrastructure at an unprecedented rate right now, and local and regional jurisdictions across the country are all trying to get their slice of the pie. And at the city, we've already been working with partners across the TMACOG region to try to bring some of this funding to our area. Back in June, we worked with the Lucas County Engineers Office and the Lucas County Transportation Improvement District to submit a $14.8 million grant application for EV charging infrastructure in 5 counties across Northwest Ohio. And we learned a lot about how these programs work in that process. So I'm going to give an overview today of how these opportunities are structured, what the timeline looks like, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we can start to do now in Northwest Ohio and Southeast Michigan to position ourselves to take advantage of these opportunities. So the bipartisan infrastructure law is currently the biggest source of federal funding for EV charging infrastructure out there. And within that, there are 2 major programs that are separate but complementary, and they have different eligibilities and structures. So the first of these 2 big buckets is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure, or NEVI, formula program, which sets aside $5 billion over 5 years for EV charging infrastructure that's allocated to states by formula. The other major initiative is the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure Discretionary Grant Program, which is $2.5 billion over 5 years in discretionary grants that MPOs and municipalities are actually eligible to apply for directly, and this is the program that we applied for, that grant that I mentioned. So if we go to the next slide, we can start to break down a little bit about how these programs work. So NEVI, the goal of the NEVI program is to build out a nationwide network of EV charging infrastructure, with the first priority being to build out designated alternative fuel corridors, or AFCs. These are primarily your interstates, but they also include some major US highway routes. To get their formula allocations, states had to submit a plan for how funds would be distributed in alignment with the program goals. Ohio was actually the first state to submit its plan. We were allocated, the formula allocated us $140 million over 5 years, and Drive Ohio is the keeper of that plan here in Ohio. And I should say that there are a lot of links in this presentation. My understanding is that these slides are going to be circulated afterwards so that you all can click on them and get more information at these resources. So if we could go to the next slide, just a kind of an overview of how NEVI is working in Ohio. So Ohio's plan includes 3 phases. In keeping with the program requirements, the first phase prioritizes build out of the AFCs in phase 1, which goes through 2024. And on this map, if you can see in our area, our 2 major designated AFCs are Interstate 75 and the Turnpike. If we could go to the next slide. So this is kind of the overview of the timeline for NEVI rollout in Ohio. Second phase is Ohio, US, and state routes. That starts late this year, goes through 2025. And then the phases 3 and 4 start rolling out in Q2 of 24 and go through 2026. So right now in phases 1 and 2, this is all being done through RFPs that the state's issuing based on like a preset list of candidate locations. I think there were 8 candidate locations on the I-75 corridor in our area, of which 1 was selected. So that's sort of like it's based on like interstate exits, right? So it's sort of, there's a preset list of places where they could put these things, and then private vendors bid on it. But it's important to note that phases 3 and 4, once the AFCs are certified fully built out, that's funding after that. Drive Ohio is allowed to make discretionary awards after that. So that's when units of local government are going to start being able to apply to Drive Ohio for grant funding directly. The details of that are still TBA, but we're keeping a close eye on that and watching with great interest. So if we can go to the next slide. This is just a bit about where we are now in phase 1 with NEVI. Late last year, the state issued that RFP. They've recently announced the first round of sites that were selected. They picked 27 sites statewide, and there is we're expecting another RFP for 16 more sites this fall. So this is just the map of the stars are the sites that were selected in the first round RFP, and the black dots are pre-existing fast chargers. So as you can see, there's really only 1 new one on our 75 corridor in that first round, but hopefully we'll see more in the next round. So if we go to that next slide. So right now we're at the city, we're just kind of watching and waiting for more information on when that discretionary opportunity is going to drop to try to be ready for it. But the other major bucket of funding in the bipartisan infrastructure law is the Charging and Fueling Infrastructure, CFI, discretionary grant program. Like I said, that's $2.5 billion over 5 years, and it's divided between 2 buckets with sort of different purposes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a minute. But it's half for corridor programs and half for community programs. It's a separate bucket of funding from NEVI, completely separate from the formula requirements, and it effectively seems to be designed to kind of function as a complement to NEVI to accelerate the build out of charging infrastructure across a wider range of types of sites. So if we could go to the next slide. So like a lot of the bipartisan infrastructure law programs, this is funded through 5 years of advance appropriation. So we know this money will be around for at least 3 more years. And the amount available is actually going to increase year over year through 2026. They combined the first 2 fiscal years worth of funding in one NOFO. That was the one we applied for. That closed back in June. They haven't announced yet when the next one will be out, but if the timeline looks the way it has for a lot of other bipartisan infrastructure law programs, I think we can probably expect it maybe sometime early next year, possibly even late this year. So if we could go into the next slide. So let's get into these 2 different buckets of funding just a little bit. So the corridor side of this program, right? Like NEVI, the corridor funding is focused on building out infrastructure within a mile of AFCs, basically supplementing NEVI's build out. And the community program kind of focuses on complementing that, right, with funds for charging in basically any publicly accessible location. So there's a lot more flexibility to put chargers in places that aren't as well served by the corridors, or places where the market incentives alone may not be enough to bring chargers to the area. So there's some different parameters around award sizes, but one of the things that I want to highlight here is that these provisions around private entity contracts, right? So on the corridor side, grantees are required to use the award to contract with a private entity on installation. And on the community side, it's not required, but it is permitted. And in both cases, if there's a contract with a private entity, the entity that you're contracting with is required to provide the 20% match. And that was a piece where we saw some of the biggest, I think, challenges in our applications. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. If we can go to the next slide. So this is uncharted territory for pretty much everyone, right? They were sort of kind of building the plane as they were flying it in terms of clarifying their requirements for these programs. As we were working on our application, there was the way the NOFO was written, a lot of it was unclear, and they were releasing more guidance pretty much right up until the deadline. So I think getting prepared now, having been through that slightly chaotic process, we know a little bit more about what we can do to get ready. Just at a basic level, I think knowing the criteria and the funding priorities, there's a lot of them. Sometimes they can seem a little bit self-contradictory, right? They want market feasibility, but they also want to fund charging in places that might not get charging stations if it were left up to the market. There's an emphasis on LMI communities, Justice 40. There are lots of different focus areas for this opportunity. So I think just reading through all of that in the first NOFO and familiarizing ourselves with what all of those different criteria are is important as we start to think about how we can pursue this funding. The NEVI infrastructure standards and requirements, everything funded through this award is subject to these requirements. There's provisions around, power delivery, plug types, uptime requirements, payment methods. So knowing those, making sure that the electrical service that's needed to meet those requirements is there, making sure that contractors are required to have a specific certification to install this infrastructure. So making sure that we're engaging contractors and the capacity is there. I think one of the biggest things that we wished we had when we put our application together was like a real analysis and a data-driven strategy for how we prioritize siting these chargers, right? So I think that knowing that TMACOG is working on this study, which I think we're going to hear a bit more about momentarily, I think that's going to be huge. I'm thrilled that this is happening, and I think it's going to be, in the event that we do have to reapply for this opportunity, I think that kind of research and data and plan is going to be crucial, right? So I think probably the single biggest challenge we saw was this piece around private entity contracts, right? Requiring entities to sign on, if you've identified a private entity, requiring them to sign on and say they'll provide the match, or if not, showing that you have a viable plan for getting, taking it out to bid, and with the understanding that whoever wins the bid is going to have to kick in 20%. Particularly with the provisions around disadvantaged communities, we were looking at chargers in places where essentially, and a lot of the places we wanted to put chargers, they were going to be on city property or on the property of some partners like Metro Parks and the library, and our plan was just to essentially provide level 2 charging at these places for free as a community service, knowing that the demand just wasn't there. That's a challenging proposition to get a private entity to sign on to. Different localities approach this in different ways this first time around. So I think, sorry, my energy saving motion sensor lights just went off. So I think really thinking through what that structure is going to look like is going to be crucial to have a viable application. Who's going to own this infrastructure? How's revenue going to be handled? How is metering going to work? These are all things that we really had to figure out on the fly. And I think now, with a little bit more lead time, going in with a plan for all of those things is going to be important. So if we could go to the next slide. So just a few resources that might be helpful in developing these applications. I won't go through all of these one by one in the interest of time, but I'll just say that there's some great resources out there for demand forecasting from Drive Ohio. There's, the AFDC has its charging station locator with existing stations, and then eDrive, that's a demand forecasting tool that allows you to define an area and adjust different parameters to weight to sort of weight your priorities and say define levels of priority for where you're placing these investments. So I think the key with all this stuff is going to be integrating these tools with the more localized analysis that hopefully is going to come out of the TMACOG study. So next slide. Just real briefly, in addition to the two big ones, NEVI and CFI, there are some other federal programs that are not as explicitly for charging infrastructure per se, but have eligibilities for it. So these are just a few of them. And then if we go to the next slide, these are just a few resources that might be useful to think about as we're thinking about creative approaches to funding this stuff. Again, you can look through these resources once we get the slide deck out, but this is just a list from the FHWA of EV grant programs and then programs that have EV eligibilities. I guess just in closing, I would say we have to check a lot of boxes to be competitive for these opportunities, and none of us can independently check all of them off on our own, right? The city of Toledo can't check the urban box and the rural box, right? But we can do it together, right? We learned a lot from this first round of the application. I think we laid a lot of really good groundwork. and put forward a pretty solid application under the circumstances. But if we do have to reapply, I think we're going to be in a really good position to put forward a really strong proposal for our region if we work together, which I'm excited to do. So with that, I will hand it off to the next speaker.
All right, thank you, Simon. I want to take a moment just to thank Simon and Josh for their presentations. I thought their information was fantastic, and hopefully you feel the same way and got a lot of good information out of that. My name is Dave Gideon. I'm the Vice President of Transportation for TMACOG, and I'm happy to talk to you today about the electric vehicle siting infrastructure plan that TMACOG is going to be conducting. Next slide, please. So with all the push for electric vehicles, we wanted to try to do something that would have an impact on the region. And as Simon noted, as you're developing grant applications and moving forward with trying to site stations within your communities, having a strategy about it and having a planned approach is very important, and it's also very attractive to the funding agencies when they're looking at individual applications. So we wanted to try to get a study in place that'll check all these boxes, that will give us a lot of good data and information and help give us a methodology for where this investment ought to be located. So the purpose of our study is to establish a strategy for identifying preferred locations where the vehicle charging infrastructure should be located. And that could include recommendations for the number of chargers by individual types, and with the goal of creating networks for charging locations that are accessible throughout the study area. Plus, we also want to have an education component to it, and we also want to provide information that would be beneficial to grant applications. Information on where some of these sources are, providing some toolkit information that you and your individual communities can take and use and hopefully directly input into funding applications to make your applications stronger and more effective. Next slide, please. So the consultant for the study is going to be Burgess and Nypel. We are using a ODOT task order consultant team, and this was under last year's contract, so Burgess and Nypel will be that consultant. We met with them to work on the scope of work. However, the study has not started yet. We're still waiting on another piece before we can get going. Once we do, the study area is going to be Lucas, Wood, Ottawa, Sandusky, and Monroe County. So 5-county area, and we are hoping that this will really kickstart the charging station applications from throughout this region. So some key elements to the study. We are going to be developing a stakeholder advisory team that will help guide the development of the study. We're going to be doing an electric vehicle infrastructure assessment, and I'll talk more about these individual items in the next few slides. A charging infrastructure analysis, and then, of course, the final draft report. Next slide. So with the advisory group, we want to establish a broad-based advisory group that will bring all of the various issues to the table and help give us the best study. So we're going to be looking at participation from local governments and public agency representatives, state agency reps from ODOT, MDOT, and other entities. We'd be remiss if we didn't include the utility providers in this, since we're going to be relying on them to be providing power to these sites. Nonprofit organizations, local fleet operators, local business owners, and others that can provide helpful insight into the development of the study. Next slide. So looking at the electric vehicle infrastructure assessment, there are going to be a few things we want to try to accomplish with this. So we want to try to get a good base of data at this part of the study. So we want to look at where are the vehicles currently. So we want to look at ownership statistics. We want to look at where chargers currently located at, what types, what number of plugs are there. We want to look at outlet costs. So what are the stations currently charging? Just to get a good base of information for what's currently out there. Next slide. Also, as part of this, with the existing conditions assessment, we want to take a look at where is site accessibility with existing power at some of these sites. If you're looking at some of the higher powered sites, so if you're looking at like a DC fast charge site, it's very helpful to already have DC fast charge available relatively close, because that is a hefty expense to be able to get that, as we heard yesterday from one of our presenters. To get that to a site can be very costly, so that will significantly increase the cost of that station. But where's power currently located at? Another important piece is origin destination travel patterns. So where are people coming from and to? I think we all have a basic understanding that most of the charging is going to be conducted at home. However, we also want to establish a network that's going to work for people that are traveling. So, or going a little bit longer distances where you may feel a little uncomfortable about whether or not you can make it from your home to your destination, but we want to understand what these travel patterns are. And then as part of the existing infrastructure, we want to know where the chargers are at, like I said, how many plugs you have, what type of a station is it? Is it a DC fast charge, a level 1 or 2? What are the land use types where these stations are currently located at? Is it commercial, residential, civic building, libraries, or other types of facilities? Next slide. And then we want to take a look at, we want to dig a little bit deeper and take a look at what are some of the policies, the requirements, and the regulations that are currently out there, and how do those impact what communities are able to do. So we want to take a look at the existing regulations, policies, requirements, and try to identify, are there any potential barriers that are going to prevent some communities from being able to take advantage of these opportunities? And then how can we minimize those barriers? That might be physical barriers, they might be policy barriers. There might be some regulations that either need to be in place or currently are not, or regulations that are in place that are providing obstacles to getting some projects built. So we want to take a look at those and assess how they impact the landscape. Next slide. On the electric vehicle infrastructure assessment, we also want to take a look at market demand. So what is the forecasted future demand for electric vehicles and the infrastructure that will require for them? So we want to try to assess the quantity of electric vehicles that we anticipate to have within our communities in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And what types of vehicles will those be? Are we going to be looking at all battery electric vehicles? Are we going to be looking at hybrid plug-ins or potential other types down the road? Just so we have a better understanding of what the actual needs are going to be for each of the regions within our communities. Next slide. On the charging infrastructure analysis, moving forward a little bit. So we want to try to develop a siting methodology, and we'll do this through a steering committee, but we want to try to understand and put together tools that will help to guide where some of these stations should be located. Not every site or not every location is going to be ideal for various charging infrastructure types. So we want to try to put together some methodologies. We don't want to tell people that your charger has to be here and you have to have this many plugs, it has to be this type. But we want to provide guidelines for what type of sites would be ideal for different chargers. So this analysis will dig a lot deeper into that. And so it'll take into consideration the facility types, what type of power is currently available. Are there public transportation connections that are serving under disadvantaged communities that are important to take into consideration? facility access, parking locations, and other types of considerations of that nature. Next slide. We also want to be able to try to prioritize the investments that are looking to be made. So as we develop this criteria, it's important that we take into consideration what's the optimal placement for these, and it's try to maximize the future use of these stations at their locations. So trying to consider the minimum energy and capacity requirements that these stations will have, the various costs, utility connections required to maintain the infrastructure, and develop prioritization criteria that also looks at disadvantaged community access to these infrastructure investments. And that's key throughout the study, and that's a common thread for every element. Next slide. We also want to dig deeper in this section as well with implementation guidelines and recommendations. So we know all communities are going to have different capacities and abilities to develop grant applications. So we are going to attempt to try to do some of this work for you. And take a look at providing some information on what environmental and permitting requirements may be that you need to look at, how to tackle right-of-way, design and site development, utility coordination, things of this nature, the purchasing of the equipment, the procurement, and identifying vendors that may meet your needs. Information on the installation of this equipment, and then of course the maintenance and operations. Most of the grants do have requirements in place that there has to be a maintenance and operations plan. There has to be a certain percentage of uptime on these stations. So we want to provide information on, how to properly maintain them, how to inspect them. If something does go wrong, how to be able to address the issue and get them back online very quickly. So all of these are going to be important considerations and are going to be important elements to include in grant applications as all of you move forward. Next slide, please. So along with this, then a financial analysis. So we want to help identify what the cost ranges would be for various infrastructure types. So if you're looking to apply for a level 2 charger, and say you want to put in 3 stations, each one has 2 ports on it, what kind of costs are you going to be looking at? So you can anticipate how much money to potentially put in your budget and help shape the ask of your application. So estimates for all project development phases. So we want to assist with that as well. So if you have to look at some site development, if you have to bring in the utilities and get them up to speed on the power that's needed for the site, what's that going to cost you? Installation, equipment, operations, maintenance, signage, all important considerations. And some of the stuff that we heard about yesterday, talking about land use, and we all want these stations not only to be functional, but we want them to fit within the context of our communities too. So looking at potentially some beautification around these things or some amenities to go with them as well. So trying to put some cost to that stuff within the study. And then identifying potential funding sources that could be available through local, state, or federal grant programs. And Simon touched on a lot of these programs, and there may be more in the future. But to try to distill some information to make it a little bit easier to identify what program may be best for your community. And then Simon did talk about the agreements with the private entities and how important that is in a lot of these applications, and we want the study to touch upon that as well. And then identifying funding sources or funding strategies and options for the ongoing maintenance costs, which will be critically important once you have stations in place to maintain that uptime. Next slide. So the current status of the study, as I mentioned, we have developed a scope of work with Burgess and Nipel. We're still currently awaiting the notice to proceed from ODOT. Since we're doing this through ODOT, we've got to check a few boxes with them. So we're hoping that within the next couple weeks, we'll have that notice to proceed. And then we want to begin this study very quickly. These funding opportunities are going to keep on coming up, and the longer that this gets delayed, the more we're going to be running up against some of the project timelines. So once we get going, we want to do this at a pretty quick pace. So we want to jump right into it and get rolling with the consultant. Unfortunately, at this current time, we don't have any estimate from them on what the duration of the study is going to be. So once we get going, we want that to be the first piece that we identify and get information out so that we can try to move this along as quickly as possible and make this relevant for all of your future applications. And I believe that is my last slide. So with that, I will turn it back over to Rosanna to coordinate any questions that may have popped up.
Yes, thank you, gentlemen, very, very much. So for those who may have joined a couple minutes late, this was a two-part session. So some of us referenced the first session yesterday. It was recorded. That will be available if you were not able to join us yesterday. Had a plethora of information on level 1, level 2 DC chargers, and then land use and requirements. And then obviously you heard a great different opportunities and great opportunities in terms of financing with our friends at the port, and Simon and all the great things that he's doing at the city and potentially working together, and then what we're doing here at TMACOG. So I welcome anybody's questions. Put them in the chat. We are doing great on time. I know we have a hard stop at 12:30, so we want to be conscious of everyone's time, but start sending your questions in and I will be happy to read them off to our presenters. Yeah, Simon.
Hi, I just wanted to jump in and say thanks to both Josh and Dave for those great presentations. Dave, I think the TMACOG study you guys are really hitting on all the right things, the right considerations. One thing I would just add is that as you think about how to, the sort of like guidance that you're developing on site selection, types of chargers, that kind of stuff. You mentioned that you don't want to tell people what kinds of chargers to put where, which I think is a good attitude. However, there are some of those details are dictated to an extent, or at least strongly incentivized by the NEVI standards and requirements, right? Like there is, any infrastructure, any charger funded through NEVI or through the CFI program, it's got to be a 4-port minimum, right?
Right. Yeah.
And then there's around payment. Just so I think just thinking about like as we're making these plans, to the extent that we can, tailoring them toward, or at least taking into consideration the priorities of these grant opportunities and those requirements is something that to maximize our readiness for those from the start, right, is going to be really crucial. And I'm happy to volunteer to be part of that stakeholder advisory group and just sort of provide input on how we can do that.
You were on my list, don't worry. No, and those are all very good points. A lot of the applications do dictate to some degree the types of chargers that are going to be required that they're looking to fund. So yeah, all that will be taken into consideration. So very good points. Thank you.
I also did want to echo what Simon said. All of our presentations will be available, and what will happen is you'll get a follow-up email from me at TMACOG, and it will have the links and the slide deck. I don't think that we'll have the recordings up and running by the end of this week, but we'll get those up on our website as soon as possible. But you'll have the link to that as well. And then most importantly, I hope you'll fill out the evaluation. We'd love to hear feedback on these sessions and on the TMACOG Tech in general. We feel this is a really great offering that TMACOG is able to provide to our members and our community partners, and we welcome feedback on how we could improve on it. If you have suggestions on other topics, we would like to do that in 2024. I'm already looking to 2024. So if you have suggestions on things that might be interesting or you'd like to know a little bit more about, please let me know. I'm happy to organize and get great speakers like we had today. So I don't see any questions coming in, which is great. But if you do, I'll give it another minute or two. And if not, we'll go on your merry way. I know a lot of us have been having technical issues today. So hopefully wherever you are, if you're in Northwest Ohio, I hope that it is, you have power and you have internet and all of that. So, okay. Hey, hi, Austin. How are you? Okay, so it says for Austin, please let me know when the advisory meetings are happening or any public meetings, and he's happy to attend and join. So thank you very, very much for that.
Thank you, Austin. Will do. Appreciate that.
Say hello to the Congresswoman from us. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions. If you do have questions after the fact, that's not a problem. Just send them my way, and I'm happy to try to coordinate and get those answers to you. But just be on the lookout for a follow-up email on our end with the resources and an evaluation. I really appreciate everybody's time. I hope you gleaned information from this, from either financing, grant opportunities, and what we have in store at TMACOG. So again, enjoy the rest of your day, and I will see you soon, everyone. I'm going to stop recording now and then get this meeting going. Okay.